AustCham, what are your main observations on the Australian and the Singaporean relationship when it comes to business?
So in terms of the relationship between Australian businesses and Singapore businesses, from an AustCham perspective, I guess what I see is the potential for one to zoom ahead of the other, and I think there's already strong evidence of that. AustCham has been quite passionate about identifying the fact that Australian business tends to be quite underweight in the region, whereas we see Singapore having this amazing ability to transform itself and really react to the changes that are going on in the world. From the Chamber's perspective, we'd really like to see Australia better understanding the way business is done in Asia and better responding to that.
What have been the main trends that you've witnessed, and what do you think the future holds for both nations?
Look, it's a fairly rosy future, I think, for all countries that are operating in this part of the world. I think one of the biggest trends that I've observed in the 20-odd years that I've been here is the sort of multi-generational development of management within Asia, and by that I mean over the last period, there's been a huge number of Asians, Indonesians, Thais, Singaporeans, etc., that have been educated in the West. So they've been exposed to Western business culture, to Western social cultures, and they've brought that back home. They've brought that back into their businesses, and in fact a lot of them are working in international businesses as well. So the market has matured incredibly. Their demands are far more mature, their expectations are a lot higher, and so there's really a need to respond to those changes that have occurred. But also, the international community has recognised the opportunities that are in Asia, and therefore there's a lot more competition. And whereas in the past, I think Australia has been able to sort of sit back and wait for Asia to come to it, that no longer exists. There's a lot more comfort from middle and senior management in Asia to look further afield and to attract the best of the world. And I guess the globalisation has made that easier, but this sort of multi-generational education and maturing means that there's just greater comfort in looking further afield.
Let's talk a little bit about the role that AustCham plays in forging closer relationships between the two countries. What are some of the elements of that, and what are some of the things that AustCham facilitates or does?
So in terms of AustCham's position as a facilitator between the two countries, I think, in fact, AustCham is maturing along with the rest of the community, and so the role that we play is different today to what it was 10 years ago. We're still very much a business networker, but more and more we want to be moving into advocacy and really identifying key issues where we can take a position to support Australian business within Singapore. But beyond Singapore, into the region as well. And I think what we've recognised as a chamber is that Singapore is a hub into the region, particularly into the ASEAN region, particularly into India. There's a huge amount of inward investment into Singapore that then moves out into the region. And so AustCham believes that we can help Australian business in terms of leveraging Singapore's position as a gateway, as a hub into the region. And that's really one of our key focus. The other thing is also, as a chamber, not to be so heavily rooted in Singapore per se, but also to be actively working back in Australia, working with companies in a proactive way to encourage them to be investing in Singapore, but also into the region. And we do that through a number of different forms. We hold an annual roadshow where we go back into Australia and talk to business in small and large groups. and really try and share some of our experiences, but also talk about some of the really positive things that a lot of Australian companies as well as individuals are doing in this part of the world.
And why do you believe it's so important to foster this relationship between the two nations, Singapore and Australia?
Well, I think if we don't, then Australia will just be left behind, and there's already strong evidence of that. There's a lot of complacency in Australian business and in Australian business thinking. So we have to be a sort of voice of knowledge, a voice of change to try and actively encourage Australian business to be looking to Singapore and beyond Singapore. I was talking to somebody very recently, and they described it as a confidence, and maybe I'd take that almost to an arrogance that exists in Australia, that Australian business can successfully exist in a relatively small domestic market in Australia, and that they're immune from sort of international competition. And that's fine if you've got a domestic focus. The bit that I don't understand is how business can ignore such a large market on their doorstep. And to be able to do that, you need to understand that your product needs to be adapted to suit whatever's required in this part of the world.